Hello, welcome back to Non-synchronous online course. In previous module, you have learned about global sanctions regimes and United States sanction regimes. From a broader sense, you also learn the importance of sanction regimes in preventing the proliferation of dual-use biological materials, equipment, and knowledge. When you dig deeper into any disaster, you will realize that non-compliance is the root cause. The consequences of non-compliance could be very damaging for individuals, companies, organizations, and our revisionist proliferator states. This module will focus on consequences of non-compliance. So let's get it started. This module is very important in order to make sure that all stakeholders of the biological supply chains understand the consequences of non-compliance. In this module, you will learn consequences of non-compliance from a broader perspective. Our focus is on protecting biological materials, equipment, and knowledge to make sure that biological researchers and all stakeholders of the biological supply chains understand the consequences of non-compliance. You will learn different forms of penalties from criminal action, civil action, sanction-based, and investigation perspectives. Talking about non-compliance is always hostile and challenging. Hence, before I proceed further, I want to highlight that this presentation is not intended to intimidate biological researchers and other stakeholders of the biological supply chains. The main purpose of this module is to create an awareness about importance of compliance to biosecurity best practices and consequences of non-compliance, so that all biological researchers and stakeholders of the biological supply chains can protect themselves and their organization or company. Compliance is good for researchers and all stakeholders of the biological supply chains because it protects everybody. Furthermore, compliance efforts are in the best interest of all, as it helps to reduce the biosecurity risks for our safety and sustainable development. So please take the module content and examples positively. Let's start with the definition of non-compliance. How can we define non-compliance? Non-compliance can be defined as failure to act in accordance with the formal requirements. Or from this course perspective, non-compliance can be defined as failure to act in accordance with biosecurity best practices. The schematic diagram shown on the slide depicts the overview of consequences of non-compliance in preventing proliferation of dual-use biological materials, equipment, and knowledge. Dual use of biological materials, equipment, and knowledge can be misused to create most dangerous biological agents. If we don't follow biosecurity best practices, the biological materials could be misused as biological weapon. In this case, it will have severe consequences on human, animal, and environmental health. In other words, it will disturb the One Health that recognizes that human health is closely linked to animal health and shared environment. As a result, consequences will be horrible as we know from the history and coronavirus disease global pandemic. Hence, biosecurity best practices are important. If we want to avoid disasters because of non-compliance, then we should make sure that everybody complies. Hence, penalties comes in the picture. For individuals, companies, organizations, or revisionist states, the consequences of non-compliance are penalties. Please bear in mind that penalties are not the main purpose of export controls and sanctions. Remember, the main purpose of exports control and sanctions is to enforce international and acceptable norms of behavior. When individuals or companies or organizations don't follow required formalities, penalties are essential as punishment by law or other authority for a crime or offense. For proper regulations and to ensure that risks are controlled in a legal framework, penalties are considered as necessary to encourage and enforce proper behavior. When your actions are unlawful, you are subject to penalties. Penalties could be incarceration, fines, and restitution. Incarceration means confinement in a jail, prison, or penitentiary in order to punish a criminal offender. Penalties could be fines, means financial punishment imposed on a dependent or company for an act of wrongdoing. Penalties could be restitution, where the dependent need to give up their gains to the claimant or giving the equivalent for any loss, damage, or injury against a company or individual or both. This case study will help you to understand how non-compliance can result in incarceration penalty. This case is of software engineering. From 1989 until August 2006, Mohammad Reza Alawi, 51-year-old, was a software engineer at Palo Verde nuclear plant in the United States of America. Alawi was a citizen of the United States who was born in Iran. In 2006, before his trip to Iran, Alawi downloaded training software from the nuclear power plant to his personal computer. The training software was used to simulate the control room at the nuclear power plant and contain detailed information about power plant, such as schematics of its design. Later in Iran, he downloaded codes that allowed him to open the software. Alawi was convicted at trial 2008 and he was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison. Penalties could be in the form of hefty fines. Civil violations of export control rules are strictly liability offenses, meaning liability attaches regardless of knowledge or degree of fault. Fines may be imposed. Assets may be blocked or frozen by the Office of Foreign Assets Control. In addition, export controls and sanctions include the authority to block any use of any property held by company, organization, and/or entity. Furthermore, the blocking of property can be mandated even during an investigation. On top of it, the regulations make assisting in blocking mandatory. For example, in the US, anyone subject to US jurisdiction is required to block an offender's property or interests in property upon official notification. US persons or companies will be forbidden to do business with you as your name appears on restricted lists. We will look into a case of Standard Chartered Public Limited Company, which is a British multinational banking and financial services company. The headquarters of this company is in London, England. From 2015 to 2018, Standard Chartered wrote over 100 loans to Danish Bank AS, which was owned by the Sberbank, a Russian bank. Sberbank was subject to the European Union's Ukraine sovereignty and territorial integrity sanctions regime. Hence, the sanctions also applies to Danish Bank. Internal control mechanisms detected the activity, and after an internal investigation, Standard Chartered made a voluntary disclosure to the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation of Her Majesty's Treasury, United Kingdom. The Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation found 70 of the loans violated the sanctions scheme. The UK government assessed penalties of £20.5 million and designated the violation most serious. So with the help of this example, you can understand what can happen if we ignore the compliance. Here, I want to reiterate that sanctions are a powerful tool. Sanctions are applied upon identification of a violation of international norms, treaties, or conventions. The denial of export privileges is usually for a period of time, but later the additional licensing requirements results in a greater scrutiny and enhanced administrative burdens. Under sanctions, individuals can be banned from travel. In other words, individuals, those are on sanctions list, will have travel restrictions. Sanctions may be goods embargoed to include arms and other goods. Let's look in a case of Mr. Nikitin and his partners. The conspiracy began when an unnamed Russian government-controlled business contacted with Nikitin and KS Engineering or KSE to purchase a power turbine from a US-based manufacturer for US dollar 17.3 million. The turbine was for a Russian Arctic deepwater drilling platform. Use and sale prohibited without a license. Nikitin admitted that he and another KSE employee conspired with Gabriel Villon and his Italy-based company, GVA International Oil and Gas Services, to obtain the turbine on their behalf. GVA then employed the services of Dali Bagru and World Mining and oil supply of Bakula city in Georgia to procure the turbine from the US manufacturer and have it exported. The parties conceal the true end user from both the US manufacturer and the US government by submitting false documentation that stated it would be used by a US company in the US. All were arrested. Nikitin faces 5 years in federal prison and substantial fines and penalties. Gabriel Villon of Italy pled guilty in June 2020 and sentenced to 28 months in prison. If your company or organization violates formal requirements, you and your business will be added to regulatory lists. From business perspective, this type of penalties can have very damaging effects on the company or organization or individual, because your customers and suppliers will know about it, and for sure it will result in reduction in your customer and suppliers base. Other compliant entities will not want to do business with you or your company or organization. If you are on regulatory list, you will find a great difficulty to conduct financial transactions. If you are subject to penalties, you have to face the formal investigation. Naturally, investigation can result into distraction. It will have an impact on your time available to conduct business. You have to pay for cost of defense. You will have stress of doing business. At the same time, it will have impact on your reputation. You may find it difficult to maintain business position. Your compliant, sensitive clients will depart. Trusted business partners will seek other reliable partners elsewhere. The financial institutions with compliance capability will turn away your business. Furthermore, you also need to consider practical considerations. For instance, your business opportunities will be overtaken by your competitors. Other possibility is that the investigation may result in application of sanctions against your country as well as your business. Therefore, always remember that your non-compliance may result in regulatory and or criminal violations, though it's unintentional or done unknowingly. This is another case study which highlights the responsible behavior of stakeholder, or to be precise, executive in a biotech company. Business executive in a Philippines-based biotech company left the office and was on time for supper with his wife and children. The conspiracy began 3 days prior when an academic institution from an Asian country contacted him late in the evening via his personal email requesting to purchase an unusual large amount of proprietary enzyme his company had developed. The next business day, the business executive conducted due diligence. Through due diligence, he didn't find the name of that person in that academic institution or that country. The executive, now curious, contacted his legal and compliance department and confirm that the enzyme is covered by many international export controls, some of which carry sanctions. At this point, the executive decided not to respond to the solicitation email. His responsible actions resulted in no negative consequences. Now, this is a success story. This case was hypothetical for training purpose, as it reflects the sense of responsible behavior of a stakeholder of the biological supply chains. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, to summarize this module, I want to highlight few important points. So listen carefully. Point number 1 is non-compliance to required formalities always results into complications depending on the nature of the non-conformity. Point number 2 is we cannot afford the non-compliance in biological supply chains, as biological materials, equipment, and knowledge can be misused to pose biosecurity threats. And my point number 3 is we as a stakeholder of the biological supply chains should follow the biosecurity best practices in order to prevent the proliferation of biosecurity sensitive biological materials, equipment, and knowledge. Okay, I anticipate that this module helped you to learn different forms of penalties from criminal action, civil action, sanction-based and investigation perspectives. Remember that compliance with required formalities is the best way to protect dual-use biological materials, equipment, and knowledge. It is in the interest of biosecurity at local, national, regional, and global levels. In the next module, you will learn the ways to counter chemical and biological weapons proliferation to mitigate risks. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video. Until then, take care and stay safe.